Hi, welcome everyone. If you can take your seats, we're going to get started. I'm Karen Cortez-Sklar. I manage the 10x10 salons with founders Russet Letterman and Olga Yatskovich. Dave Solo runs our grants program, and Jeff Gutterman helps with photography and publications. Shay Bosch is our editorial work scholar. We are very happy to be hosting the salon at the Center for Book Arts. A big thank you to Karina Reynolds and Camilo Otero and the entire Center for Book Arts team for facilitating the salon. 10x10 Photobooks is a community-oriented organization that champions, facilitates thoughtful and passionate engagement with the photobook through its focus on contemporary practice, overlooked publications, stories, and creators in photobooks histories. Founded in 2012, 10x10 is a visionary leader in the photobook field, supporting diversity and creative exchange through public photobook events, including reading rooms, salons, publications, grants, and partnerships with arts organizations. If you like what we do and who we support, please consider donating to 10x10 via our website, 10x10photobooks.org, or pre-ordering our new book, Flashpoint, Protest Photography in Print, which releases in the US just after Thanksgiving. There's a copy in the back to browse, along with a QR code to make a pre-order. Tonight we have two presentations, Jesper Haynes and João Pina. João. Jesper will present first, followed by João. Afterwards, we will have time for questions, followed by book browsing. Both have brought books to sell, so please take a look and consider supporting their creative work. 10x10 does not take a cut of their sales, so you are fully supporting the artist when you make a purchase. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce Jesper Haynes. Jesper Haynes is an American-Swedish photographer known for capturing urban life and intimate moments over decades. He has published 15 books and zines and exhibited his work globally in cities like New York, Bangkok, Stockholm, and Tokyo. Haynes has also worked on collaborations with the fashion brand Chanel. In 1986, Jesper moved to an apartment on the corner of St. Mark's and First Avenue. It was above the St. Mark's Bar and Grill, where the Rolling Stones had just filmed the video for Waiting on a Friend. His home for 20 years, the apartment is the backdrop for much of his photography during this period and is compiled in his book, St. Mark's, 1986 to 2006, published in 2015. His most recent eponymous book, Jesper Haynes, published in 2022, also presents a collection of images from the 1980s to the present, including his projects, New York Darkroom, Haynesville, Gig, Brooklyn, 11211, Shibuya, Scramble, and Bangkok, 202021. Please welcome Jesper Haynes.
Okay, let's see. Is it better? I almost feel more comfortable. Is it okay with you if I don't do the mic? Or can everyone hear me? Or is this better? Okay, we'll do it this way. Thank you. All right, so I was going to talk a little bit about self-publishing because that's what I do. It started with the first book which was mentioned, which is this one here, actually. This is called St. Mark's, 1986-2006. And when I took the pictures over 20 years, I never thought I would make a book out of it. But then when my landlord died and I got kicked out, there was a bit of, there was a lot of reflection, you know, like what am I doing now and what am I doing with all these pictures? So I, maybe I go to next, well, this is part of, how should I present this? This is coming up in my next book, but it's kind of part of what I want to talk about St. Mark's too, because living in New York in the 80s was very intense, and I'm going here. So this was the first show I did with the St. Mark's material, and when had this exhibition, I felt like I needed a companion, like a book. So I made a handmade copy, which looked pretty much like this one, and that sold out very quickly. I only made like 40. So then that was the first kind of notion that I could actually sell photography books or self-published books. So I printed 500 of these and sold them quite quickly, actually. And that was the beginning. So here we go. These are from that book. This is St. Mark's and First Avenue. So all the pictures were taken either inside the apartment or through the windows. The one to the right is during the infamous riots in Tompkins Square Park and in the neighborhood in the mid-90s. And this, now we get into the process of making books. So I have never learned how to make a book on the computer. I do it very analog. I make prints, different size. I try again, and I make, like you can see here, like little notes. Try different things, and ends up like that in the book. Same thing here. So what's on the right, that's how the book starts usually. Like I print hundreds, many hundreds sometimes, of 4x6 prints. And then it's an elimination process, basically, and trying to figure out which pictures goes together and why and so on. That's what you see on the left side there. You can, a lot of these images you see here ended up in the book like that. And this is from my last book, all of these images. And this is also the first time with this last book that I'm adding text. So in the back of the book, I write about every picture that's in the book, so it follows like this. Can everyone see, or should I read it, or you can see, right? Sorry? Yeah, I think you can. But and this again is from the window on St. Mark's and First Avenue, sometime in the late 90s, probably mid-90s. And but I always also enjoyed making exhibitions, so they always came together. So I would make a book and an exhibition, sometimes at the same time. Sometimes I would start with making an exhibition and then make a book. So this was called New York Darkroom, and which became a book as well, which is about New York in the 1980s and 90s. And in this particular show, you entered sort of a dark room, and you can't really tell in the picture here, but it was so dark, so the only way you can see what's on the wall is by using the flashlights that were hanging down from the ceiling, and you can sort of navigate through the room. And you even had dark room, you see here on the right, there are dark room trays, and people could develop pre-exposed prints and take with them. That was This is all New York in the mid-1980s. And here's some text. I mean, I can talk about the text, or you can read it. I don't know what's easier, but basically, when you live downtown New York in the 80s and even through the 90s, you couldn't help but sort of seeing the scene, the downtown art scene. I mean, it was all around us. So it's been a lot written about that. But, I always like contact sheets. I still take pictures. I mean, I still shoot film sometime and still develop, and there's something about a contact sheet. So I have that in a lot of my shows. I put up contact sheets on the wall, blown up. So all this text is actually text that's in the end. I explained already, but it's in the end of the book. So if the reference 7475 is to page 7475. This is from my little TV I had back then. And now we're moving on to another project that I do. Besides these books that I self-publish, I also do a series of zines called Haynesville, which the name comes from it's the town my father was born in Louisiana, in northern Louisiana. It's a tiny little town, and I started to make them, I think sometime in maybe 15 years ago, the first one, 10 years ago or something. Which is, I feel more free, I can do whatever I want. So this here, for instance, this is the last one. It's a little, you know, it could be anything. The sizes are different, the themes are different, and in this particular case, in this picture here, I set out a little table outside PS1 when they had a book fair. I applied to be inside, but I didn't get accepted, so I just put a table outside, which was it was great actually. It's like everybody passed, and it was nice. Plus I loved her bag. I don't know if you can read what it says, but it says, "I'm not mad, I'm in a perfectly happy mood, you asshole." It just kind of, yeah, there's something relatable to that, I suppose. This was on 42nd Street when I keep mixing up. It's not Barbara Kruger. It's Jenny Holzer, of course. When she took over the whole 42nd Street, the old theaters, and put on her own sort of signs or lettering. It's also a time when I start to experiment with using spray paint on my prints. A little bit out of frustration when people said, you know, when you have with photography, you can print endless. So it's not a one-off. So I figured if I put spray paint, that is one-off. That's only one. So I had a show in Tokyo where I just had all the spray painted prints, and then they ended up in one of these Haynesville books as well. This is in Calcutta. This is up in northern Thailand. It's opium. That's in New York. This is a show I did also where I did all the pictures as negatives. I was curious if people could read them as negative. I mean, read the image when it was sort of reversed. And it's a portrait of a Swedish photographer, Anders Pedersen, who is a good friend, who always said his advice was always step closer, you know, get close when you photograph people. And this is in my last book too, some text. The text to the left has sort of been my philosophy for a long time, as far as when people ask, you know, for advice, how to be able to make a living self-published photography book. I always say lower overhead. If you don't have too much expense, maybe it's one way you can do it. So, and these are some of the titles. It's not all of them, but some of them that I have here tonight. And I think that's it. I mean, I can talk forever about a lot of things, but I think that's good. Yeah? Okay, if you have questions, we do that afterwards. I think we're doing a Q&A, so. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jesper. Okay, up next is João Pina. João is a freelance photographer born in Portugal. He began working as a professional photographer at 18 and graduated from the International Center of Photography program in 2005. Oh, let's get your image in. I'll just keep talking. Pina's photographs have been published in the New York Times, The New Yorker, Stern, Time, and Visual, among others. Pina has published several books, including Por Teu Livre Pensamento in 2007, featuring the stories of former Portuguese political prisoners, Condor, published in 2014, an exploration of the remnants of Operation Condor, a large-scale secret military operation to eliminate political opposition to the military dictatorships in South America during the 1970s, and 46750, published in 2018, which focuses on the ongoing urban violence in Rio de Janeiro and the city's transformation over the past decade while preparing for the 2014 FIFA World Cup and the 2016 Olympic Games. Tarrafal, published in 2024, his most recent book, presents a dialogue with his grandfather, a political prisoner, along with the images made inside the Tarrafal concentration camp, nicknamed the Slow Death Camp. Please welcome João Pina.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here, and thanks to 10x10 for inviting me. It's an interesting moment for me to be here because in 2020 we had agreed to do a salon with my previous book, and it was late February, and this weird thing called COVID was kicking in, and we were like until last minute to decide if we were going to do the salon or not. Obviously, the rest is history. We did the salon online, and it was fine because it was the first 2 weeks of us being online, and after that, I was just so bored from being in front of a screen that I sort of like erased that from my mind until Russet reached out again a few months ago. It was like, oh, you have a new book coming out. Well, how would you like to finally do a salon? So I'm very happy to be here and very grateful to have not been forgotten by 10x10. Well, as it's already been said, I'm here to present my latest book. And like Jesper, who was just presenting before us, I think you also photograph to remember, and I certainly do photograph to remember, not because I'm afraid, which I think eventually I will lose my memory, but I have this like very engraved idea that we must remember in order to understand what's coming at us. And that exists obviously because of my own family experience and the fact that, as it's been referenced already, my family had spent a long time in prison for political reasons in Portugal, where I'm from. And I grew up with that. I was the first generation born in democracy, but I was very instructed in the effects that dictatorships can have on people's lives. And it's particularly important for me to say this in November 2024 in a country that has never lived a dictatorship, but whose institutions seem to be imploding at every second. So I just wanted to acknowledge that in order to explain how I landed on this work. So in this photograph, what you're seeing is actually my great-grandmother, Herculana Carvalho, in 1950, deposing flowers in the grave of a political prisoner called Francisco do Nascimento Esteves, who died in a concentration camp. That concentration camp was created in 1936. If any ideas of what was going on in Europe in 1936, it was the beginning of the concentration camps in Germany, and how our dictator, Salazar, sent someone to Germany to see how things were being done and decided to replicate it. But he decided to replicate it in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean in an archipelago which was then a Portuguese colony called Cape Verde. And today, fortunately, Cape Verde, it is a fully independent and democratic nation after many years of struggle against Portuguese colonialism. The reason why I'm doing this introduction is to explain you that I grew up with the stories of my grandfather having sent to this camp for political reasons, and of his parents having gone to visit. What I was told as a child was that they had gone and visited, and there had been some photographs made, and those photographs had been given to the families. And that was pretty much all I knew until maybe 10, 15 years ago. My mother told me, there's a box, and in that box there are family photographs, including photographs from Tarrafal, this camp. If you ever want to look at it, it's kept, and she told me where it was kept. But because I have already been doing this for a while, and I know the problems that entail opening archives, and then the frustration in not having the resources to work with archives, I hold off to any approach to this project until 2019, when I finally got a grant in order to start a project about Tarrafal and about Cape Verde. And it was only when I had, because as was also been mentioned before, I had worked in Condor for 10 years. I have worked in my Rio book, 46,750, for 10 years. So I knew the driving force and the energy that it requires to do so. And I also know what it is to do that without money in your pocket to go and to work. So I decided I wouldn't want to do that again. And in 2019, when I finally had the opportunity to gather all the money that I thought I needed to do this project, I decided to open the box. And in that box, the first envelope that I opened was an envelope that said tombstones in Tarrafal. And I looked at this image, and then I looked at more images, and I finally looked at more images. And there were the 32 photographs of the 32 political prisoners who had passed in the camp from torture to malaria to the no drinking water for many, many reasons. Between 1936 and 1948, these 32 men passed in the camp and were buried in the camp without the families having been notified. So these photographs actually served the purpose of letting the families know that actually their loved ones had passed, but also served the purpose of this sort of like performative act. And when I first opened this envelope, what really thrilled me were the fact that this woman, which happens to be my great-grandmother, was paying an homage into every single grave, bringing flowers, and these same flowers are repurposed for every photograph that's been taken by my great-grandfather. And I was deeply impacted by this. As I looked to this sequence, to me was obvious this is almost like a storyboard of a film to me. And I started immediately recording this and thinking of what to do with it. And I've been for 5 years looking at these images and reinterpreting them, and they are the central part of the book. And this is the reason why I brought the book. It's because I approached this book as sort of like the onion, and I wanted people to start peeling the reality away until they got to the center of the book, which is where these images lay. They're exactly at the center. And we have different fold-outs showing all these images in detail. They're facsimiles, so they're pretty much the same size. But I was also faced with another very good problem for a photographer, which is inside of that box, there were not only these images, there were hundreds of other images, including this one from my grandfather smiling at the camera. And for someone who's used to work with the idea of historical memory and history and all that's entailed with that, looking at a young man smiling at the camera, it's not the ideal way of speaking about a concentration camp in my own head. So I was thrilled by that. But then at the same time, I was like, yeah, I started to put myself on my own grandfather's shoes, and like, yes, if I was detained in a concentration camp, and if I had my parents standing in front of me, I would probably be very smiling as well. So I started trying to get into the idea of what these men were seeing when they were being photographed. So they also knew these photographs were going to be brought home to their families and delivered to them. So there is a very performative aspect to these images, and I was very interested in that. And I'm still going back and looking at them, understanding who they were, reading about them, sometimes speaking to their families who received these photographs. But then, as a good friend of mine who is a curator, a great curator, when I first showed him these images, he looked at me and basically said, and excuse my words, João, you are fucked. Because you land on 800 negatives, and what do you do with that? I'm like, I'm supposed to be an image maker. I'm not a curator. I'm not an art historian. I'm not an historian. I'm not a politician or a political scientist, but I have all these materials in my hand. So I had to pay an homage to the photographic process. That was, to me, the key to the start of this project. And in order to do so, I had to go back to the basics. I would have to go into the darkroom, and I would have to enlarge these photographs. So I did. I grabbed 120 negatives, and throughout a year and a half, I kept going back and kept going back and kept going back and enlarging these images, because they had only been used as small contact sheets that would be given to the families, or best case scenario, like 4x6 prints, because in 1949 and 1950, you would not enlarge photographs that big. So to me, that was sort of like what I was meant to do by grabbing these images, going back to the darkroom, looking at them, sort of like having conversations with these people while I'm in the darkroom, looking at them and studying their images. And that's when I start getting very, very close with these materials, and also managing to understand what I wanted to photograph. So I was done with that. I was ready to go to Cape Verde. I was ready to go back to the camp. I was ready to see it for the first time and to photograph it, because in the end, I am a photographer, and that's what I was meant to do from the first place. So I did. In 2020, just 3 weeks before the beginning of the pandemic, I went to Cape Verde for the first time. Well, not to Cape Verde, but to the Santiago Island for the first time. And I approached Tarrafal in my own ideas, or preconceived ideas, in order to go to the camp, in order to document what was left of it. And that was sort of like the first stage. I had done this type of work before with Condor. I had done a lot. My first book, it's also about Portuguese political prisoners. So I was not a stranger in this type of places. I know where to look. I know what to look at. I was thrilled by doing that. But at the same time, I wanted to unveil stories that hadn't been told. And the part that in Portugal people normally know about the word Tarrafal, it was served as a camp for Portuguese political prisoners. What very little people know, it was also served as a camp for African political prisoners after 1961, when the independence movements for the Portuguese colonies started, first in Angola, then in Guinea-Bissau, and then in Cape Verde. So I was very interested in telling that part of the history as well, because that is the type of history that it's not still the fascist story is not in the Portuguese history books, but certainly not the anti-colonial fight. So a lot of these men were actually alive. This one in the photograph, Toku, just passed away last month. But I was lucky enough to have time with them, to interview them, and to spend time documenting their stories and portraiting them. So creating images that would show them who are they, where are they today, as I was making this. So that was the second part of the investigation. But then the third one, which to me was also quite important, is that my great-grandparents had been to Cape Verde in 1949 and 1950, which was then a Portuguese colony. But I was very interested in Cape Verde as it is today. And today, Cape Verde, fortunately, is no longer a colony, fortunately, is a democracy. And how does that happen? And how people live in a situation like that. It's also a place where 2/3 of its population lives overseas. A lot of them in Portugal, a lot of them in New England, a lot of them in in Holland and France. So only 1/3 of the population lives in the islands, and I was interested in that. So I kept going around, I kept photographing, I kept meeting people, I kept documenting, which is what I know how to do. And in the very end, I was faced with an even larger problem. Now I had not only hundreds of images from my great-grandparents, a few other hundreds from the National Archives, and actually a few thousand from myself. And like, now how do I do something with this? So this is the important part where I started not working on my own, which is normally what we as photographers do, but reaching out to others, reaching out to designers, reaching out to publishers, reaching out to a whole lot of different people in order to have their inputs on these images and help me figure out how to make the book. Because the ultimate thing that I wanted to do with this body of work was a book, because I believe that books outlive us. Books live in libraries, books live in people's shelves, and we can go back to it and we can always learn from it. So I wanted to produce a book, something that would outlive me, hopefully. And I reached out to a few different people, and finally I settled with working with Ghost Books with Stuart Smith in London. And for a good part of a year and a half, we were trying to figure out how to show this, how to tell this story. And so these are actually the last photographs that I've made, exactly a year ago, or in December a year ago. When I went back to Portugal for Christmas, I had lined up a number of objects that I needed to photograph in order to finish the image making part of the book. And so I did. I laid out a small studio and I went around where these images, or where these objects are kept, and documented it thoroughly in order to also show people what the prisoners were producing inside of the camp, from documents, political documents, to musical instruments, to the money, what would substitute money inside of the camp. So I wanted to approach this as documenting every single aspect of the camp that I could lay my hands on. But then I was faced with an even harder problem. I'm a photographer, I'm not someone who normally writes, and I had all the correspondence that my grandparent and his parents exchanged throughout his tenure in the camp. And as I read these letters for a few times, and there are about 800 letters, I started seeing the importance of publishing some of these words. But these words, without being contextualized, they would pretty much be in vain. So I had this idea that I don't know if it was a terrible idea or a brilliant one, of writing letters responding to those letters. So I spent months selecting the letters that I wanted to respond and trying to write for them in order to give the audience. I'm obviously not thinking that my grandfather, who's been dead for 51 years, is going to read them. I am not that crazy just yet. But I thought it was important for me to address them, because I could not envision a way of writing for an audience. I had to write to someone, and that someone's face, I needed to have it in my head. So what we did in the book, and you'll later can take a look at it, is that we intercalated the photographs with written text and the facsimiles of the letters in order to contextualize what actually you're seeing. So these were my grandfathers, and they're handwritten. My great-grandfathers, they're typewritten. And because my handwriting is so bad, I decided to typewrite it in a computer. But I also turned these letters into photographic objects. So I wrote them, and I thought of them as I would send them. And I actually did send them, not to them, but to my mother. And I started attaching objects, attaching photographs to these letters in order to give the reader also a visual way, and how these letters would look like. So that was what I did. But to me, the most moving aspect of this project is the fact that my great-grandparents, when they returned to Portugal, both in 1950 and then in 1951, they went around the country to visit all the families that had family members kept in the camp. And they not only processed these images and deliver them the prints, but they also went around to photograph all of the families so they could also send the photographs back to the camp, who in many, many cases, the prisoners hadn't seen their loved ones in a very, very long time. So that's my final chapter of the book. I start with the archive of the prisoners. I go through my own images. I go through the landscapes of the country, the stories of the political prisoners, the camp itself, the stories of the African political prisoners that I interviewed and write. But then also I wanted to finish with this idea of these people and how these folks were living in under sometimes very, very dire circumstances, because the providers of these families were in prison for, in some cases, 17, 18 years. So they were left alone and abandoned by the Portuguese fascist state. And this family that was my family that had a lot of resources, they were able to go around and at least give them the honor of having the prints and having news from their loved ones, which to me was a very moving gesture that they give and they kept for decades. Because this, despite ending in 1950, the image-making process here, the relationships between these families lived as long as my great-grandfather did, and he lived until 1978. So this, in my way, was a way of grabbing my own family's history, but also expanding it to not only the Portuguese, but the colonial history of Portugal, and trying to frame it somehow to make it relevant for others to look at in 2024, which happens to be the year that Portugal celebrates 50 years of its democracy and the end of fascism, but also a year of where fascism seems to be rising all over the world. So it's always never too late for us to stop, think, rewire ourselves, and be ready for what's coming. So not to leave you in a negative note, I always like to end this with a photograph that I made that made me smile quite a lot. Because Tarrafal is not only the camp, but it's the village where the camp lays. And that village is actually quite amazing. It's known for the best beach of the island. It's the only white sand beach in the island. There's some really wild parties in January when St. Amaro is celebrated, but there's a lot of partying around it. So it's a place where the Cape Verdeans often smile when we reference them to them. And the vans that go from the capital city of Praia into the village of Tarrafal, people in the road know where the truck is going to. In the year that I was there, they end up with the I love Tarrafal. So I always like to end in a positive note. There is a lot of hope, there is a lot of freedom, and there is a lot of joy to be lived in places, although they have been used for oppression and repression. So thank you, everybody, and have a great night.
Okay, there's a question.
I have a question for Joel, if I might. You made some references to what you saw in the history of your country and what you see possibly coming up in our country. Could you elaborate on how a photographer such as yourself might be able to deal with these issues or communicate with others?
Before or after my visa gets revoked by the incoming administration? No, even if I wasn't, I'm not going to not speak out because of what's going on. I don't know, to be honest. I think I have developed somehow some skills to look at what's happened in the past. I've worked a lot in contemporary issues and in places that often people are fighting against each other, fighting for their freedoms. I don't know what's going to happen in the United States. I'm certain that as long as my visa is still in place and I don't need to be smuggled into the country, I'll be around to look at it. But I don't know what's coming. But I'm certainly thinking about how to document it, for sure.
Good luck with that.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Thank you. I have a question
the way you say my name, it's...
When I pronounce João, we recognize right away. And I just came back from Cape Verde. I lived there for 2 years. And I agree with you, Tarrafal today is a resort area. It's lively and it's very fun. So the prison or the concentration camp is a museum, as you saw, but today is not at all associated to that. But my question for both is, as you're explaining how you're building, how you develop, I mean, you start with the archive, then you slowly start to understand you wanted to take more pictures. So I was curious how both of you work when you have a story in mind and then you take the pictures according to the story you want to tell. Is more the story evolves as you have a lot of pictures taken, and then you start to decide what the story you want to tell. So is the pictures give you the story, or is the story already in your mind? And for João, I have another question not related to this book. So I didn't know your work, and I appreciate that 10 by 10 sent me this invitation, so I checked more of your work, and I really like your books. And I was curious about the work you did in Brazil, because I saw you were very close to some of these gangs, and I was like, wow, he's still alive, he's still here, so how did you manage to get so close?
No, go ahead.
Okay. All right. As far as like the first book I made, I had no idea I was going to make a book. I had my camera with me every day wherever I went. I was always taking pictures. So that happened gradually over many years. But since then, I've been much more focused. So to your question, I've done books that are quite themed, even though they're very different. I did a book in Shibuya Crossing in Tokyo, where I started to take pictures of legs crossing back and forth over this amazing place where millions of people pass every day, and realized that there was something there. And then I went back and shot over a period of a couple of years every time I went to Tokyo. I've done other projects where I lean out the window of my apartment in Brooklyn, shooting down over a period of time. And so those are kind of theme-based, where I know beforehand that this is going to be a project, this is going to be a book. And there are other times where I go back and look at contact sheets and I see, wait a minute, there's something here. So both ways, I guess, if that answers it.
In my case, it's a little bit different. I do have an idea if I want to make a book with a project or not, and I start never thinking of the book and the sequence. I start by looking at the images, what's going on in front of me, and how am I reacting to that. Only later, when I get into the book making process, is that I start thinking of an edit and a sequence and how the book will look like, and if I'm missing something. For example, what I've showed with Tarrafal is the objects. At the beginning, I started to photograph some objects, but they were not consistent photographs. So I felt the need of going back and re-photograph it in a consistent way so the book would hold those objects. But normally I don't think of like, I want to do a book, this is the story, this is what I'm going to photograph. It's the way around. I start photographing, I figure out what the story is, and I work in nonfiction, so it needs to be related to reality somehow. Now with Tarrafal is different because I decided to write, and I decided to write to people who are no longer with us. So it's somehow fictionalized, although what I'm writing about is anything but fiction. I'm writing about my own history. I'm writing about my process of making work. I'm writing about my countries and the world where we live in that history. So I don't consider it to be fiction, but it's somehow fictionalized because it's not addressed to an audience. It's addressed to my ancestors. So yeah, I think that answers your question. Regarding the Rio book, and there's a lot of work that I do that reacts to contemporary events, and I think that way I work as any photojournalist would. You develop sources, you develop contacts, you develop trust, and that gets you into the position of making a photograph. They don't happen out of the blue. I didn't land in Rio and next day I'm photographing gangs. It took me 2.5 years just to have someone to agree to welcome me, to speak to me, to be photographed. And it took me 10 years to do that body of work. So I'm alive because I know how to do that, I think. in a way of developing trust and only raising the camera when I think it's okay and when people agree to it. So that's what puts me in the position of being able to go in and out of these situations. The same with the police. I've done a lot of police raids. Sometimes hard things were happening, both done to the police and also done by the police. And you need to make very quick decisions about what you photograph, what you show, and what you don't. And for you to have an idea, the Rio book has 67 photographs out of nearly 50,000 that I made. So there's also that editing process, and where do you decide what to show and what is too much and what it isn't. So it's very fine lines that, in the case of the Rio book, happened 6 years ago. Today, eventually the edit would be different. So as you evolve as a person, as an author, as a photographer, also your vision is altered by it. So I think it's important, to me at least, to look at my past work as where I was with my own work when I published that book. So Condor was 10 years ago. It was also another body of work that I have spent a lot of time working and trying to conceptualize a book and then an exhibition. Even if it was today, I wouldn't change anything because that was the person who I was. And I put myself in those situations because I was mostly curious about them, rather than thinking that an image will change the world or any of that. No, I'm deeply curious about the world. I'm curious about the world that I grew up with, but I'm also very curious about the world that I don't know. And that's what I set off to go and do, like long-term projects. I think that answers your question.
I was a photographer and lived on St. Mark's Place.
Yeah.
And during that time, I was not as cool as you. But I guess I'm very interested in how the medium has changed. Because back then it was film, and you had to consider like the expense of it and develop it and spend a lot of time with it. And now I find I shoot most everything on my phone. And I'm kind of interested to know like how that technology has changed what you produce, if it has affected it.
I mean, it changed so many things. For one, it was much easier to photograph people I found back then because I was the only one with a camera. So I would go to nightclubs, or I would go to events, or even in the street. And if I wanted to take a picture of a person, which was a way to meet people, right? It was the key to, Allen Ginsberg lived on 12th Street, and I visited him and Peter Orlovsky there, and I had a camera, and that was the key. And now you can't use that anymore because everybody have that key. So that's a huge difference I found as far as that goes. But there's also a very what's the word?
Democratization.
Yeah, with the fact that everybody has a camera now. So there's something very beautiful about that too. And in the beginning, when we went from digital to analog, and later with the phones on the camera phones, as a photographer, I was worried, but I also realized that it's much bigger interest in photography thanks to that. So there's a big plus as well, as far as interest in photography. I mean, that's.
I definitely agree with you. I remember I started working in 1999 as the first very bad digital cameras existed. And in 2001, me and a friend, we bought a digital camera together. And people sort of forget about this, but a 1 gigabyte card in 2001 costed $1,000. And I remember having to go around photo editors, because I was working for mostly magazines and newspapers, and having to convince them to assign me to photograph in digital, because everybody was very suspicious of digital and the quality and print quality and all of that. And I remember, like, fast forwarding 3 or 4 years, I had to convince photo editors to allow me to photograph in film. And then it was this tension about, like, oh, I want to do this, but there is no strict deadline, so we can actually enjoy and work in a different way. Can I shoot medium format film? It's like, oh, and I started having the looks. So it was very interesting. But then with the introduction of cell phones, which I'm terrible at using, so I don't really shoot with my phone, I really started understanding the idea of the immediacy of the photograph and being certain of my interest not in the immediacy but in the lasting effect of a photograph, the idea of the memory, right? We have a very photographic memory, and I am moved not by the images of what happened today, but I'm moved by looking at images of something that happened in the past, and I look at an image. It can be a family photograph, can be a world event, but the power of the photograph, the lasting power of a photograph, it's really what interests me. So I've decided to approach it in a much slower pace. And I must say, I started this project photographing in film, and this is not an advertising for Hasselblad, but I was working with the Mamiya 7 when Hasselblad released an amazing digital medium format camera, and they lent me the camera for a few months. I was already deep into the project, and I just remember getting to Cape Verde, and like on the second day, I'm like, motherfucker, why didn't they release this camera before I started? Because the quality was so amazing, and I was wasting so much time and money in film that I'm like, oh, I just wish this camera existed. So I ended up buying that camera and finished the project with the two cameras, because there were some things that I was working with that were deeply impacted by film. These diptychs, for example, they are film diptychs. So I'm photographing them as we're seeing them, one frame, and then I move the camera and I do the second frame. And that's why I imagined it that way, already thinking of the book form. And I had to keep going that way. I couldn't do a fake digital diptych. It wouldn't make any sense for me, because I was still very engaged with this idea of the homage to film and the fact that these negatives exist and I can still enlarge them. I have no idea if my digital files in 70 years, camera raw, will even read it. So I am very concerned about this idea of the memorialization of what we're doing today and what's the archive of the future going to look like.
Yeah.
But the book, we know that an acid-free, cotton-based paper, will last at least 100 years. Digital files are going to last that?
We don't know. No, I agree. We don't know. I mean, I shoot film still. I shoot 90% digital, but whenever I do a project, I always bring the film camera as well. Almost like a backup, like a few frames to have it on an egg. I know this is going to be around, so.
Yeah, I'm with you. But saying this, the Rio book is all photographed digitally, because I was on that story and magazine, and I need to deliver if it's the case. So, and I didn't have money for film, so I just used the digital camera all the way through. And in the end, actually, the biggest problem was how to have the files approaching to each other, because in the 10 years that I've photographed, digital cameras have evolved immensely. So files evolved immensely, and when I was printing, it needed to be somehow even. So that approach with my Tri-X, developed with my X-Tall at 9 minutes and 45 seconds at 20 centigrades, it never changes, right? So.
I have a question for Jesper. I was very interested in how that you were working photographically, and then you started using spray paint on the imagery. And I was wondering if you could tell us how that process worked for you, because the image, it really changes drastically when you use the
Yeah.
spray paint. It becomes it looks like it's more about decay, and you're also tapping into a different medium, and also, like, are you a photographer or not? It's like you're playing psychologically with the imagery. And I
Yeah.
was just wondering how you thought about it, and how do you feel the same way about it today as when you did it, and if you're still working that way?
Yeah. No, I did it as an experiment. Like I said, because I was frustrated over the fact that when you print, especially digital, you can just print endless amount of the same thing. So I did a show with those spray painted, and they're all sold, which was nice too. I mean, all of them. So I guess I should go back and think about that some more. But now with AI photography and so on, I'm thinking to go back. I started to go back into the darkroom. So my next project is actually to print from film negatives on fiber paper, real paper, not RC paper, and also adding spray paint on top. So putting layers of layers, but somehow maybe becoming more of an art object than a classic photograph. So that's what I'm playing with now.
Thank you so much for coming. There are books in the back for sale, so please support our artists. Thank you.